Hello and welcome to We Are the Deluge, a spoiler-free chapter-by-chapter podcast about the climate change novel The Deluge by Stephen Markley. We are your co-hosts, Emily Crandall and John McMahon, 0.8 to 1.2 degrees centigrade hotter than your average podcast hosts.
I'll take it.
Today we are discussing the hypothetical New York Times op-ed on climate policy, which we are presenting in the form of a mock headline and discussion.
Beautiful. I despise / a little bit love my headline, so you should go first because I want to prolong this as much as I can from having to say this out loud.
Great. I went for old white guys desperate to pass the mantle of their failure.
Oh, that's a good one. I went with, I can't believe I'm putting this to tape. Okay, boomer, don't be a climate doomer.
Oh.
Sorry.
Ooh.
Sorry. Then
perfect. And we are using that, obviously.
Okay, fine. Then I went with the climate old guard forges ahead as they exit the stage, but have they learned anything about politics?
No is the answer.
Yes.
Yeah, I forewent a subhead just because I was like a little uninspired by their uninspiring op-ed.
Yeah.
A new hope for the planet is like, what?
ChatGPT.
Yes, right? I was like,
maybe
asked,
he did, for all we know. Well, maybe he wrote the book before. Yeah.
Or he's like, this is what they would pick if they ran it through AI, right?
That would make sense because there's definitely in later chapters like news that says, by whatever AI program checked by human name X.
Right. And this one is just like they're just lazy and old and they don't think of it as plagiarism. Even though we all know ChatGPT can't think for you. Correct.
What do you think he's doing by having it be these three in particular? So it's your classic trio. It's McKibben, it's Gore, it's Hansen.
Yeah. I mean, I guess like Hansen is sort of obvious, right? He was very sort of central during the Bush eras of climate movement when there was, for a time, right, the bipartisan interest, willingness, and commitments to just, things done on the part of the environment. But I think he's also, I mean, like I wrote a whole chapter about this in my dissertation, but he's been one of the climate scientists who has like taken this debate about the science to the public. So he's been involved in a lot of very kind of public disagreements with primarily economists who quibble with him on the hard, fast nature of the data, which we'll get to, I assume, in our next episode.
Yeah. If I'm also remembering correctly, so Markley did like a 3-minute interview hit on, I think, Seth Meyers' late night show around when the book came out. And if I'm remembering this interview correctly, Markley like got a sit-down meeting with Hansen as to like talk about climate science and talk about like that role that he has played in the scientific and political and cultural debates of the decades. So
that would make sense.
It's also a bit of an homage, yeah.
Right, or he probably like asked for permission, I would assume, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, maybe because if he had that relationship, but like it's fair use,
Yeah, that's true. Gore, I guess, I don't know. Okay, well, I think John did some research in advance.
By research, Googled for 26 seconds.
What is Googling for 26 seconds if not research, my dear friend? About like what these figures have actually said about policy. So like one thing maybe for selection criteria is that they actually say stuff about policy proposals.
Yes.
Right.
And interestingly, different stuff in the real world. Right. So Gore supported the Green New Deal. Hansen called the Green New Deal in 2019 nonsense and instead advocated for a carbon tax. And then McKibben's obviously been a supporter. And the other thing about McKibben is that, like, obviously I know, a decent amount about him. I didn't realize that he's part of this third act movement situation, whose webpage is utterly fascinating.
I haven't read it, but
I spent some time just before we got on air, like poking around it. Experienced Americans are the fastest growing part of the population, 10,000 people a day, past the 60-year mark. That means there's no way to make the changes that must be made to protect our planet and our society unless we bring our power into play. then there's like an homage to like the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, the women's rights movement.
Is this like politically mobilizing the elderly?
Yeah, politically mobilizing people over 60 on climate and democracy issues.
That's actually fascinating.
It's
because
a great idea, yeah.
But also this op-ed kind of ends the opposite way.
Precisely. And then this is I think the most telling and most like ripe for analysis part of this website. It's just thirdact.org.
Wow.
But as a generation, we have unprecedented skills and resources that we can bring to bear. Washington and Wall Street, interesting, it says both, have to listen when we speak because we vote and because we have a large, maybe an overlarge share of the country's assets. And many of us have kids and grandkids and great-grandkids. We have, in other words, very real reasons to worry and to work. So, yeah.
I wanted to flag a couple things.
Please.
In the section where they propose stuff. I was like trying to break down what are not the specific proposals or specific targets, but like what are the components that constitute like a total proposal, right?
Yes.
So it's on the one hand, the pace of change, the scale, the incentive structure.
Yep.
And then there's the question of justice. And I have a question, is like justice about well-being or is it about political expediency? Right. And then there's the question of like how to bring other actors along when you're doing legislature at the national level, right? Other global actors.
Right.
And I thought that was like it's interesting to think about those components. And maybe we'll talk about this a bit more in the next kind of big policy chapter itself. But it strikes me that like the tacking between the moral urgency and the political expediency has a lot of like echoes or resonances with debates around abolition.
Oh, say more.
I was thinking like literally about William Lloyd Garrison, right? Who's like, we cannot abolish slavery by like compensating slave owners for their lost property and by doing it piecemeal, one state at a time, or over the course of this, whatever. It's a moral scourge. And if we do not do it immediately, we're not doing it for the right reason. Right. And I think you see this same tension in like debates around prison abolition, right? Like, do we do this huge package policy reform that on the one hand gets at why so many people go in the first place, on the other hand gets at what the conditions are like when they get there, and on the other hand gets at the barriers to reentry that they face for a variety of logistical and bureaucratic reasons, and like target like 100,000 tiny little problems and like roll it out over the course of the next 15 years. But you see historically in the United States, when you do things in that way, that typically the initial effect is to worsen in some cases, right? Certain patterns of exploitation, of racism, etc. So I think this is
and to generate a particular form of backlash, right? Like I'm thinking about the backlash across New York State around cash bail reform.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was just on my mind when I was reading this op-ed.
I think the justice question is really fascinating because the op-ed would like to have it both ways. And I think maybe that's indicative of how kind of maybe mainstream liberal or mainstream progressive climate discourse would like to have it both ways, because the sentence that comes before that, the justice sentence, is starting at 50 a ton, the carbon price will have the effect of not only making emissions more expensive, but will give every American a quarterly check that will invest them in the process of decarbonization. Right? It's like that's an instrumental reason, a good instrumental reason, but an instrumental reason nonetheless. The quote, scare quote, justice, close quote, element of this plan should not be overlooked. So the appeal to justice, some sort of higher notion, I think we would say so. Then, as research has shown, putting money in people's pockets will allow a strapped populace financial breathing room while also stimulating the economy. Right? So back to the like good instrumental reasons, right? So like what exactly justice means in this op-ed, I think tells us about how like the phrase just transition, which also shows up in this op-ed, has somewhat come to exist in excess of thinking about justice, right? It's become this kind of catch-all category that if you are an environmental justice person, you're thinking about it in very justice forward ways. But if you're just like a policy wonk on the like progressive democratic side, it's just a phrase that you use to invest people in the process of decarbonization.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that's necessarily or exclusively a bad thing, but I think it's a notable thing.
It's very interesting at the very least. I have one more thing in this op-ed that was reminding me of prisons in particular.
Yeah.
One is the mention of refugees and a potential influx of climate refugees that that the state infrastructure wouldn't be able to support. And I think I think for those of us who were young when 9/11 happened, we tend to think about the dramatic increase in immigration detention as a feature of like Obama era politics and like discourse around Guantanamo, right? The closing of Guantanamo, the failure to close Guantanamo, the promise of being disappointed by the promise of Obama, and then like the intensification on explicitly racialized grounds of immigration detention in Trump. But if you look at immigration detention in the US, when it starts becoming a really intense system that has like a strong kind of mandate from the perspective of the state's interest in.
Can I guess? Is this like Clinton years?
It's it's around the Clinton years, and it gets and it's about terrorism, and then it gets mandated by the war on terror, and institutionalized, and just like dramatically increases in the early aughts. And if you look at the national security apparatus, the majority of what it does actually in the US is immigration detention or immigration management, administration, detention. And a huge part of immigration administration is detention in the US. And it's like, you know, the terror of terrorism isn't acts of terror itself, it's others, right? Racialized others from elsewhere. And so I feel like tapping into that fear, even when you're doing it under the guise of the questions of justice, whether those are instrumental or genuinely held, is so dangerous. I don't know. It just reminds me of like everything that's going wrong with the current election cycle. Yes. From my perspective.
Same. That's a fascinating analogy, because if I was to like put it into the words of the op-ed, it's like there would need to be the problem of climate refugees, however it's phrased in the op-ed, should rather be climate refugees to whom, for whom we should welcome, expedite the process, not detain like prima facie or at all, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Like that's the actual position that would be necessary.
Yeah.
So as to avoid the entering into the circuit of right-wing white nationalist like immigration policies that then get adopted by mainstream politicians in both parties in the US.
Yeah. And under the guise of like competition, security. Right? And security. Like, I'm going to be a good president because I'm tough, right? It's like tough is the language of justification of the state's right to detain people without any reason.
Yep.
I don't know. And that goes back to the war on drugs, right? Yeah, I'm obviously thinking about this a lot because I'm teaching a class on prison right now, but it's just like, it's everywhere here. And I don't know. I'd never thought the degree to which I've thought about the intersection of like the problem of incarceration and the problem of climate change has largely been about sort of like where prisons are located, right? Like the already vulnerable condition that incarcerated people are in, made more vulnerable by vulnerabilities of pertaining to climate change, right? So like, the most recent hurricane in Florida, this like conservative as fuck, governor says everybody leave, which is like, first of all, shocking, but like what happens to the prisoners, right? What happens to the people who are incarcerated? So I thought about that a lot, but I've not really thought too deeply about the infrastructure of detention and incarceration as like coextensive with or overlapping with the infrastructure of like climate policy or lack of climate policy, if that makes sense.
Sounds like you just wrote the abstract to Crandall, Mashinsky, and McMahon 2027.
Ooh. Okay. You know what? Let's write that down. This is why we're doing a podcast.
Right, instead of actually writing anything.
Yeah. It'll be transcribed.
I'm putting this under public scholarship on my CV. Like,
I mean, honestly, I think at this point it definitely is.
Oh, for sure.
Anyway, this is. Oh, sorry. I keep like starting things here, but I have one more thing.
Please.
There's a reference to the melting glacier.
Mm-hmm.
Did you read a couple months ago? There was an article in the journal Science about this, like, I think 7 or 9 day tsunami in the year 2023 that hit this island in Greenland called Ella Island, which is like nobody lives there, but it's a place where people do a lot of research.
Mm-hmm.
And like scientists were seeing these like super weird, I forget exactly which branch of science was collecting this data, but like weird hums like from the island. And then when people finally went to it to see what was going on, they discovered that like half the island was sort of like crumbled because of this like 7 day tsunami that was just hitting it. And there had been like a tour. So I think people go there on tours, not to stay because there's nowhere to stay, but I don't know if it's like science tourism or just like wildlife tourism or what, but there had like been a tour the week before and they were like, oh, if those people had been there on that tour, they would all be dead. But like this idea that there are places that are like physically crumbling where nobody is, but we can still see it. And like, does the degree to which we think about that place that no one lives impact on us, like mitigated by the fact that nobody lives there, or like we don't see it except as these like hums on, some machine that some scientists in like Canada are monitoring? Like, I don't know. I'm getting scared.
That's a justice question too, right? It's like, what is the scope and who is included in the discussion of justice, or what is included in the scope of justice?
Yeah, like, should we be mourning Ella Island?
It's a wonderful question.
I don't know.
And if so, for what reason, right? Like on its own terms, or like for itself, or
for
as
us.
Harbinger of, right?
Yeah. And like, what's the relationship between those two modes of mourning is, I think, something that, at least to my knowledge, is underexplored in environmental ethics.
Mm-hmm.
But
a whole research agenda from Emily Crandall over there.
I don't know what's happening
for this podcast. I'm going to make one more point, maybe great. 2 small ones before we head out. One is that, and this I was playing off of course, in my terrible headline, but the way that they are kind of using this that Barclay is using this chapter and next chapter to communicate, like, okay, this is the slight speculative fiction, science fiction element of it, because warming starts happening, we find out, much faster than we expect it to happen in our world, right? In the world of the book, it's moving much faster. But that leads to this point. They say that 2 degrees looms, anything past that, quote, would likely be the end of global civilization as we understand it today, right? So just that, like, what is the purpose, and like what claims are actually being made by the mobilization of that specter, as we've talked about a couple of times already on the podcast. Then the other point is just, name checking Kate Morris and Tracy Alman-Zaihow with Greta and AOC from our world. As these boomers age out of the stage and build the multiracial, multi-generational, right? Whatever the phrase is, they end it with.
Oh yeah. Progressive, multiracial, multi-gendered, talented, and passionate. I think
it's not bad, actually.
Multi-gendered and talented in next to each other in a list is just like chef's kiss. I love it.
Yep.
But I also feel like it's so boomer to say multi-gendered.
It is. It is. I honestly respect the Markley making that the sign of them doing the work, or trying to do their boomer version of doing the work.
Yeah. It's good. It works for me.
Like they, all of them have a non-binary grandchild or whatever the case may be, and like they're trying to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. They sure are.
That's the chef's kiss to end the episode on.
So, listeners, stay tuned. Up next, we have the second chapter from Ash's perspective, which is called Executive Summary on Legislative Negotiations for the Pollution Reduction Infrastructure and Refund Act of 2029, set in 2029. That does not roll off the tongue.
It certainly does not, but we're about to say it 17,000 times in the span of an hour in this next recording.
I love it.
Thank you for joining us, listeners, on We Are the Deluge, and
we are the Deluge.
We sure are.
We sure are. They sure are.